I laid the folder on his desk like a loaded weapon. Inside, my resignation letter, time-stamped copies of falsified reports, and a note that read, "You won't bury this the way you buried your conscience." David Bishop didn't look up. He was mid-call, probably massaging a lie into something billable. I didn't care. I turned to leave, and that's when he said it. "Smart timing, Elise. Too bad you're not the only one who knows what you've been up to." I froze. I turned back. "What does that mean?" He finally looked up. Calm. Almost bored. "You should really ask your friend Mia about the little meeting she had this morning." No emotion. No anger. Just the quiet confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. I didn't say a word. I walked out of his office, past the floor-to-ceiling windows that made our firm look more transparent than it was. Past Jonah, Rosa, Kevin. All staring. Silent. Then I saw her, Mia, standing at the elevator. Not meeting my eyes. I moved toward her. "Mia, what the hell did you do?" She wouldn't speak. Just stared at the floor. Her face flushed. I stepped closer. "You told him." Still nothing. Then the elevator dinged. She stepped inside. Before the doors closed, she finally said, barely a whisper, "He would have destroyed you, Elise." The metal slid shut. And my heart did something I hadn't felt in years. It cracked. People started whispering. Phones buzzed. The firm moved like a hive sensing smoke. The first spark had landed, and I was the match. I walked straight into the open bullpen, climbed onto a chair, and raised my voice. For anyone wondering, yes, I quit. And no, I'm not going quietly. A few heads turned. Some froze. Jonah stood up, eyebrows raised. I pulled out my phone and opened my inbox. There it was, confirmation from the journalist. Files received. She'd start digging today. By Monday, half of our clients will know what we've been hiding for years, I said. And when that story drops, no NDA in the world is going to keep this place intact. People were standing now. Dan let out a long breath. Holy sh**T. Then came the sound I hadn't expected, clapping. It was Rosa. Slow. Small. But it spread. Jonah joined in. A few others. Then, security burst through the side entrance. 3 men. Suits, badges, earpieces. Not building security, corporate security. Hired muscle for internal fires. One moved toward me. "Miss Hartley, you need to come with us." I laughed. "You're about 5 minutes too late." I jumped off the chair, pushed through the nearest exit door, and ran. Down the emergency stairs. Past people who didn't know yet that everything was about to change. Out into the cold morning air that felt sharper than freedom. That's when my phone lit up. Account access revoked. Pending legal review. Breach of contract. Immediate action recommended. I stared at the screen. My savings. My 401k. My health insurance. All frozen. They weren't going to fire me. They were going to erase me. And the worst part? They could. Unless I beat them to the truth. I looked up just as a cab slowed near the curb. And behind me, I heard someone call my name. Samantha. The intern. Out of breath, clutching a tote bag. "Is it true?" she asked. I nodded. "All of it." Her eyes filled. "You think I should go back in?" "Only if you want to become like them." She stood there a moment. Then threw her badge into the street. And got in the cab beside me. That was the moment. The moment I stopped playing their game and started writing my own. I woke up to a private message with no sender name and only 4 words. "You made a mistake." It was 6:03 a.m. I hadn't slept more than an hour, not with my phone vibrating every few minutes from news alerts, calls from blocked numbers, or colleagues pinging me on burner accounts. I ignored most of them. The journalist hadn't published anything yet. She was verifying. I expected the firm to retaliate, but not before noon, not before they had time to draft their official lie. But they moved faster than I had. At 6:27, my bank locked me out of my account. I tried calling. They said the account had been flagged under internal investigation due to fraudulent income reporting. I hung up before I said something they could record. By 7 o'clock, I was sitting on a metal bench at Riverside Park, staring at the Hudson, clutching the only thing left that felt real, my old notebook, the one I hadn't written in since my 20s. I wanted to believe I had done something brave, something necessary, but the truth was simpler. I had detonated my life without confirming there was ground left to stand on. Samantha was beside me, holding 2 coffees she had gone out to buy with her own cash. She didn't speak until I took one. "They've blocked me from the intern portal. Email's gone. I'm guessing I'm not getting school credit anymore," she said, trying to smile but failing. "My dad's gonna love this." I kept my voice even. "They're gutting everyone. I told you that might happen. I didn't think it'd be overnight. They want to scare you. Scare all of us. They already have." Before I could answer, a man I didn't recognize sat down on the other end of the bench. Expensive coat. Subtle watch. Familiar posture. My body tensed. He didn't look over. "I'm not here to threaten you," he said calmly, still looking straight ahead. "But I need you to understand something. I'm not with them anymore," I said. He ignored that. "You went after accounts tied to 3 sitting state officials. One of those officials is linked to offshore laundering. You didn't just poke the bear, Elise. You crawled into its mouth and lit a match." Samantha shifted. I held the coffee tighter. He finally looked at me. "They don't need to silence you. They just need to discredit you enough that no one listens. You people buried health scandals, environmental violations, sexual abuse lawsuits." He cut me off. "I'm not you people. I'm the guy they send when you become a problem." I didn't flinch. "So what now? You want me to recant?" "No. I want you to understand the terrain." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You have maybe 48 hours before this story either becomes truth or trivia. If she publishes without concrete sourcing, they'll chew her up. Then come for you harder. If you want your name to mean something when this is over, you need to show them you're not afraid to bleed." He stood. "She'll call you at noon. If she doesn't get what she needs, she'll walk. Too much risk." "Why tell me this?" I asked. "Because I don't like working for people who think money's a god." Then he was gone. Samantha stared after him, stunned. "Do you know him?" "No, but I believe him. We went to a public library. I found an empty study room. I took out my notebook. Not the encrypted files, not the press summary, my notebook. I started writing. Not for evidence. For clarity. I detailed every client lie I'd helped polish. Every time I'd ignored a data point that didn't fit the narrative. Every silence I'd been paid for. I didn't dress it up. I didn't redact. I didn't soften the names." At 12:03, the journalist called. I answered on speaker. "You've made it hot," she said. "Too hot. I've got 2 sources backing out and 1 editor asking if I've lost my mind. Tell me you've got something I can put in print without legal turning it into a grocery list." "I've got something better," I said. "Give me an hour. Make it count." I ended the call. Samantha looked terrified. "You're going to publish it yourself, aren't you?" "Not yet. First, we leak it." We found an old contact of mine, David Shin, a low-level freelancer who ran a blog that major outlets stole from regularly but never credited. I handed him the unredacted confession. I gave him 3 hours head start. He didn't ask for money. By 4:15, it was everywhere. By 4:40, my name was trending alongside terms like fraud, liar, and fabricated files. The firm had released a statement accusing me of orchestrating a media stunt to cover up personal misconduct. They included a time-stamped report of a security breach tied to my login credentials 2 days before my resignation. It was false, but it sounded true. Then came the second betrayal. Mia went on record. She told the Standard I'd acted erratically for months, that I'd tried to get her to forge signatures, that I had delusions of whistleblowing, and wanted to feel like a savior. She hadn't just sold me out. She'd lit the rope I was hanging from. I closed my laptop. I couldn't breathe. Not from panic, from anger. I stood, grabbed my coat, and looked at Samantha. "We're leaving." "Where?" "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere I can write." "Write what?" "Everything. Not the polished version. Not the corporate version. The real thing. That'll finish you." "No," I said. "That'll start me." We walked out into the cold. And this time, I wasn't running. I was done being a pawn. Now I was the author. The cottage was smaller than I expected and colder than I wanted, but it was off the grid enough that no one could find us unless I told them how. A friend of my brother's used it for seasonal repairs and kept it stocked with instant coffee, mismatched mugs, and just enough bandwidth to send an email if you stood near the window. That was enough. We arrived after midnight. Samantha fell asleep on the couch in a coat and shoes, her bag still zipped on her chest like she expected to be chased out before morning. I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor against the bedroom door with my notebook in my lap and my back to the world. By noon, the fallout had grown teeth. The story David Shin published was being credited to someone else by two bigger outlets. They quoted his article word for word, stripped his name, and attached their own bylines. The major networks weren't touching it. Too risky, too messy, too unverified. The firm's legal team issued takedown notices that made some sites fold within hours. The rest plastered disclaimers under the article. I checked the source folders we'd backed up on cloud drives, only to find one already wiped. I was out of time. They weren't fighting the truth, they were exhausting it. Samantha woke up and asked what the plan was. I told her there wasn't one. I said we'd just write, that I'd put everything into a book and release it on my terms, even if it meant giving it away for free. She didn't respond right away. Then she pulled out her laptop and opened a blank document. She didn't ask for permission. By the third day, someone tried to break in. They didn't knock. They didn't announce themselves. I heard the rattle of the back door while I was boiling water. It stopped after 20 seconds. No broken lock, no shattered glass, but when I walked around the side of the house, there were fresh tire tracks in the dirt, wider than a sedan, too shallow for delivery. I didn't tell Samantha. I just packed up everything digital and put it all on an external drive, then shoved it under a loose board in the bedroom floor. From that point on, I worked by hand. No sync, no upload. Paper and ink only. 2 nights later, Mia sent me a voicemail. 38 seconds. She didn't apologize. She didn't take anything back. She said she never meant for it to go that far, that she thought maybe they'd scare me, maybe make me go away for a while, but not ruin me. Not erase my name from every resume, not turn my parents' home address into a public forum where strangers mailed threats. She said she was scared, too. Then she ended it with, "Don't call me back. They're listening." I didn't save the message. I didn't respond. By the end of the week, the journalist who was supposed to be my lifeline posted an op-ed distancing herself from the leak. She said it was important to let the legal process determine the facts, and claimed I had provided material without context. My name was still attached to the data. She just wouldn't vouch for it anymore. I read the article twice, waiting to feel surprised. I didn't. I spent most of that weekend rewriting everything from memory, removing the documentation and replacing it with first-hand accounts. I told stories no one else could disprove because I had lived them. I described boardrooms, project pitches, private conversations behind closed doors. I gave no dates, no legal vulnerabilities, just experiences, just the kind of ugly that hides between official lines. It wasn't journalism. It was testimony. I didn't write to convince anymore. I wrote to reclaim. Samantha handled the formatting. She built a simple site with a digital lock on the back end. No name on the cover. Just a title, "The Silence You Paid For." I told her to publish it at midnight on Sunday. She set the timer. Then she went outside and smoked a cigarette she'd been hiding in her coat since we left the city. I watched from the window. She looked younger than she was and older than she should have had to become. I wanted to ask if she still thought following me had been worth it, but I didn't need her to say anything. She didn't leave. On Monday, the story broke, but not mine. The firm leaked a new scandal tied to a junior partner who had quietly resigned the year before. They offered full access to reporters. It was real, but old. It had nothing to do with me. It was distraction dressed as disclosure. And it worked. My name dropped off trending by Tuesday morning. Wednesday night, we checked the site stats. Over 10,000 downloads. Mostly anonymous. Some comments. A few emails to the burner account. One stood out. A senior manager from another firm said she read it in one sitting and forwarded it to her team. She said she wasn't brave enough to go public, but was no longer willing to lie. She signed it only with the initials KM and added one sentence at the end: "If you're still writing, don't stop." I didn't. That night, I added a new chapter. It wasn't about the company. It was about my mother. About the way she used to read my stories and then say, "Be practical." About how she looked relieved the day I chose PR over publishing. About the time I got a poem accepted in a tiny magazine and never told her because I knew she'd ask how much it paid. I wrote about how I let her voice replace mine. And how I finally stopped waiting for her approval. When I put the pen down, Samantha was asleep again, curled up in a blanket on the floor. Her laptop was still open beside her. She had started writing something of her own. The file name was simple, untitled docs. I didn't touch it. I just closed the lid. I had no idea if we were safe. But we were telling the truth. And this time, that was enough to keep going. I was brushing my teeth with bottled water when I heard the knock. 3 sharp hits. Not urgent, not timid, measured. Samantha sat up on the floor instantly, still tangled in the blanket. Her eyes locked with mine. I moved to the front window slowly, careful not to shift the curtain too much. A man stood on the porch, holding a paper bag in one hand and his phone in the other. He was in his late 50s, plain jacket, decent boots, not someone I recognized. I waited. He didn't knock again. Just stood there. I signaled Samantha to stay down and walked to the door. I opened it an inch and kept my foot behind it. "You're trespassing." He didn't smile. "Elise Hartley? Who's asking?" He held up his phone, screen outward. It showed a screenshot of the download page for the book. I read it twice. It's not perfect, but it's good. I waited. He set the bag down. "I brought food. I thought maybe you hadn't gone into town yet." I stepped out and closed the door behind me. "You drove out here just to tell me you liked the book?" "I was in the area." "You were 2 counties away." He nodded. "I used to do comms for Merrill back in '09. I've seen how these machines work. Thought maybe I could help." I didn't answer. He took a small notebook from his coat pocket and handed it to me. I kept logs. Names, meetings, language they used. It's old, but the patterns don't change. I opened it and flipped through. Acronyms I recognized. Jargon that felt too specific to be invented. Several names still active in industry. Not enough to build a case, but enough to make it harder for anyone to pretend I was just making things up. He took a breath like he wanted to say something else, then changed his mind. "I'm not here to join your crusade. I just thought maybe you were the first person dumb enough to not walk away." I looked at the bag. "What's in it?" "Half a rotisserie chicken, carrots, and something that claims to be bread." "Don't eat the bread." I opened the door behind me and took the bag. "Thanks. But you should go." He didn't argue. As he left, he added, "You should rotate your router MAC address. They'll find the IP if they're serious." By the time I got back inside, Samantha had already searched his name. He was real. Had spoken at 3 ethics panels, all quietly removed from streaming platforms in 2015. Hadn't worked in anything public since. She said we should be careful. I said we were already past that. We ate in silence. The chicken was dry, the carrots undercooked. We finished all of it. Later that night, the emails started. Not dozens, hundreds. Mostly anonymous. Some praise, some threats, a few that bordered on incoherent. But buried between them were pieces I hadn't expected. Attachments. Voice memos. Documents from people who claimed to work in related industries. 2 whistleblowers from biotech firms. 1 from a city grant office. A former speechwriter. None of them wanted to be named, but all of them wanted to be heard. Samantha started organizing everything into folders. She tagged dates, sources, story potential. I asked her why she was doing it like it was her job. She said, "Because nobody else will." By the end of the week, I had enough content for 3 more books. But something about the pattern started bothering me. The files were real, too real. Clean formatting. Organized. Sanitized. They didn't read like desperate people sending truth. They read like curated leaks. At 3 in the morning, I called David Shin. He answered on the fourth ring. "They're feeding me," I said. "Someone's feeding me material they want me to publish." "I figured they would," he said. "What's your concern?" "That it'll discredit everything else. That they're planning something fake in the middle of what's real, waiting for me to print it." He didn't hesitate. "Then don't publish it." "If I don't, the momentum dies." "Then check every word. Line by line. Take your time. Or lose the war fast." Before he hung up, he said one more thing. "You're not a writer anymore, Elise. You're a target. Don't forget that." I went outside and sat on the porch with the laptop on my knees and my phone disabled. I opened one of the newest files, supposedly from a health insurance employee. It listed blacklisted clients, rejection codes, buried statistics. I copied one of the names and searched it through public records. The result came back, but it wasn't a client. It was a judge. The same judge assigned to a class action suit against one of our former clients. I closed the laptop. At dawn, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I didn't answer. They left a voicemail. It was my mother's voice, but it wasn't her number. "Elise, someone came to the house. They said they were from a background check firm, but they started asking about your high school transcripts. What is going on? You need to call me." Samantha came out and sat down beside me. "What happened?" "They're pushing now. Harder." She didn't speak. She just reached into her coat and pulled out a single printed page. It was the cover of her own story, the one she'd been writing. No title, no author, just a date. "Next week." She said, "I'll publish first if you're not ready." I looked at her and didn't speak. She said, "You don't have to be the only one bleeding." The first mistake came at 6:19 a.m. I clicked a link buried in one of the anonymous emails, just a PDF, supposedly a government document. I opened it without disconnecting the Wi-Fi. By 6:22, the network locked up. Samantha shouted from the other room. She'd been uploading backup chapters to an encrypted drive, and everything froze mid-transfer. I cut power to the router, removed the battery from my laptop, and yanked her Ethernet cable. It didn't matter. They had what they needed, or maybe they didn't need anything at all. Maybe they just wanted to remind us they were still watching. I called Shin. He didn't pick up. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. Samantha checked her phone, then checked mine. No service. The cell tower we were pinging had gone dark. That wasn't an accident. She asked what they were trying to stop. I told her maybe they weren't trying to stop anything anymore. Maybe they were preparing for something. Retaliation wasn't a strategy for them. It was a routine. I told her not to answer any unknown numbers, not to use the laptop, not to open any physical mail if it arrived. She said she understood. She didn't look scared. She looked angry. We spent the next 4 hours restoring offline backups. Old USBs. Printed transcripts. Paper notebooks. Anything that couldn't be altered remotely. Samantha handwrote a copy of her own piece, then sealed it in a plastic bag and hid it behind the loose bathroom panel we'd found during our second night. I spent the afternoon calling former contacts from a burner I'd hidden in the lining of my coat pocket. One answered. An old assistant from our Boston office. She told me that 2 days after I resigned, they had hired a third-party agency to build a psychological profile on me. Not a legal defense, just a character teardown. She read me a list of keywords from the internal report: unstable, erratic, disruptive, potential narcissistic tendencies, emotionally volatile, compensatory behavior. I asked how they'd justify it. She said they didn't need to. The suggestion was the damage. Then she hung up. That night, I started bleeding. Heavy, sudden, fast enough to soak through clothes. I hadn't had a period in months. Stress had shut everything down, but this came on like someone had flipped a switch. I sat on the bathroom floor, shaking, while Samantha ran through the emergency kit for anything helpful. We didn't have anything useful. She offered to drive to town. I told her no. I didn't want her tracked. I told her I'd be fine. She stayed anyway. I passed out twice. Woke up once with her on the other side of the bathroom door, reading aloud from a book she'd found in the cottage kitchen. Something old, dry, full of typos. She said she figured it was better than silence. The bleeding stopped after 4 hours. My pulse was low. I couldn't keep anything down. I told Samantha to sleep. She didn't. At dawn, she sat on the floor beside me and read one of the new anonymous messages. It was short. "Your story dies with you." She asked if I wanted to respond. I said no. I asked her to burn the laptop. Not wipe it, burn it. She didn't hesitate. We did it behind the cottage, using lighter fluid from the shed and a shallow pit dug with an old camping shovel. It took longer than I thought. Plastic warps before it melts. Samantha didn't look away once. When it was done, we stood there until only the heat remained. I didn't ask her what she was thinking. She didn't offer it. We returned to the house, sealed off the bedroom with towels under the door, turned off every electronic device except the emergency phone hidden under a board in the kitchen. It wasn't much, but it worked. At 2:46 p.m. it rang. No ID. Just a number string I didn't recognize. I answered. A woman's voice. Calm, clipped, familiar cadence. "Elise, this is not a threat." I waited. "It's an offer." I said nothing. "Your story ends in 2 ways. Quietly on your own terms, with time to rewrite and publish under a pseudonym, free from litigation. Or it ends with a court order, asset seizure, character assassination, and professional blacklisting that spreads to anyone attached to you." I asked her name. I don't exist on paper. I asked what she wanted. "We want you to understand that courage doesn't protect you. Accuracy doesn't protect you. Documentation doesn't protect you. What protects you is distance. If you walk away, you get to keep your voice. Maybe not your name, but your voice." I asked how she found the number. "We've had it since you bought the SIM." I asked who she worked for. "I'm not calling on their behalf. I'm calling for your sake." Then she hung up. Samantha listened to the recording. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she asked, "Do you think she meant any of it?" "She meant every word I said." "So what do we do?" I stood, walked to the bedroom, pulled the notebook from under the floorboard, and laid it flat on the table. "We finish it." "You're publishing yours next week." She nodded once. I added, "But not from here." She looked up. "Where?" "Somewhere we can't be followed." "How do we do that?" "We disappear before they erase us." She stared at me, then said, "Then we need to move tonight." We left just before midnight. I scrubbed the place of prints, burned the trash, pulled the batteries from anything that could track us. Samantha packed her manuscript, cash, and 1 set of clothes. We buried the rest in a shallow ditch behind the well, poured bleach over it, then covered it with broken branches. She didn't ask why. I didn't explain. The car was borrowed. A rusted station wagon registered to a woman who died 4 years ago in Michigan. I'd traded a favor for it in a parking lot near Albany 2 months earlier, before any of this started. I wasn't planning to need it. Now it was our only option. We drove in silence for the first 3 hours. No music. No headlights on open roads. No conversations that could reveal anything we hadn't already agreed to forget. At a gas station outside Freeport, I went inside to use the bathroom. I kept the door unlocked in case I had to move fast. Someone had spray-painted a Bible verse above the mirror, black marker bleeding through years of failed attempts to clean it. I didn't read it. I checked for cameras, found 2 disabled ones, and a 3rd hidden in the corner, lens cracked. I washed my face with cold water and stared at the skin under my eyes. It didn't look like mine anymore. I looked like someone trying to outrun something they couldn't name in public. When I came back, Samantha was in the passenger seat, hands clenched. A man parked 2 spots over. He was watching me. Did he say anything? No, but he didn't blink. We drove 10 more miles, then pulled into a closed nursery with tall hedges. I swapped the license plates with a 2nd pair from the trunk, ones I'd stolen off a retired contractor's truck 2 states south. Samantha didn't ask where they came from. She just handed me the screwdriver and helped hold the bolts. It was the first time I saw her hands shaking. By sunrise, we reached a small rental property off the coast, one of those places advertised as rustic but wired with just enough surveillance to be dangerous. I paid cash, refused the security deposit, and signed under a fake name I hadn't used in years. The woman at the front desk glanced at Samantha, then asked if we were sisters. I said no. She didn't ask again. The house had no signal, no working internet, no television. There was one radio in the kitchen that picked up 4 a.m. channels and a static-filled weather report. That was fine. I didn't need news. I needed space. We took shifts sleeping for the first 2 days, never both out at once, never too far from the door. Samantha covered the windows with old towels. I used duct tape to reinforce the locks. Every night, we placed our notebooks in a sealed plastic container and hid it in the crawl space under the floorboards. It was hot, cramped, full of rotting insulation, but it felt secure. I didn't sleep more than an hour at a time, but I didn't dream either. That was progress. On the 3rd night, I found an unmarked envelope under the front doormat. No return address. No stamp. Inside was a grainy photo of my father, taken outside the assisted living center where he'd lived since the stroke. The back of the photo had a time written in red ink, 7:42 a.m., and the word unattended. I stared at it for 10 minutes. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year. I didn't even know they knew he existed. Samantha walked in as I was folding the paper. What is it? Nothing. You're lying. Doesn't matter. She watched me place the envelope in the freezer. If they know about him, they'll use him. I'm aware. So what do? We keep writing. We're not safe here. We're not safe anywhere. That night, I finished the final chapter. I stripped it of anything poetic, anything that could be misunderstood. It was about the first lie I ever told in my career, a misrepresented quote used in a political smear campaign. I had been 24. It was a small edit. No one questioned it. It made the news cycle, did its damage, and disappeared by Friday. But I remembered the original quote. I remembered who we hurt. I included her name, the correction she emailed that never got posted, and the way my manager congratulated me for being precise with my edits. I remembered the moment I decided it wasn't really my fault. Then I described what it did to me. Not just that week. Every week after. When I finished, I didn't cry. I copied it to 2 separate USB drives, placed one in the crawl space, and gave the other to Samantha. If something happens to me, you publish. You said not from here. We're not publishing here. We're just preparing. Where then? I have one last option. She waited. My uncle has a cabin across the border. He owes me for something I never called in. It's isolated, old, no digital anything. But he'll protect us. Why haven't we gone yet? Because once we go there, there's no signal left. No contact. We disappear for good. Is that what you want? It's not about what I want. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she stood, zipped her backpack, and asked how soon we could leave. I told her we'd go before sunrise. We each had 1 shot left to finish what we started. I wasn't going to waste mine. We crossed the border before noon with forged IDs and a trunk full of handwritten pages wrapped in plastic. The crossing was rural, unstaffed, unmanned. A gap in the fencing near an old logging road, patched with chain link and zip ties. My uncle had marked it years ago with 3 red stones stacked beside a stump. He told me it was a leftover route from an abandoned timberline, used now only by hunters and people with reasons not to be seen. We parked the car deep in the brush, covered it with a tarp, and hiked 2 miles through uneven terrain. Samantha didn't complain once. By the time we reached the cabin, her shirt was soaked through, her boots caked in mud, but her grip on the bag hadn't loosened. She had memorized the order of the pages in her draft, just in case. The cabin was worse than I remembered. Mold in the corners, dust everywhere, windows cracked and covered with old newspaper. The generator worked, but only barely. No plumbing. The water pump outside had been locked with a rusted chain I had to break with a tire iron. Inside, we lit 3 oil lamps, cleared the floor, and spread out the drafts. I didn't sit. I walked the room, rereading, correcting, checking the order. Every few minutes, I looked through the window, even though there was no signal, no reason to think they'd find us here. But habits don't vanish just because geography changes. By evening, we'd decided. We wouldn't wait anymore. We'd published both books, hers and mine, through mirrored drives across 6 preloaded accounts. The triggers were manual. No timer, no network dependency. All it required was connection, even briefly, and the file would release. We would risk one satellite modem, activated for less than a minute. We practiced the upload 5 times with blank files. No failures. No hiccups. On the 6th attempt, we would do it for real. Samantha prepared the encryption keys while I read the final draft of her story. It wasn't about the firm. It wasn't about me. It was about how silence becomes currency in corporate structures that punish noise. She wrote about her parents, about watching her mother fake enthusiasm after returning from shifts where she was degraded, overlooked, forgotten. She wrote about ambition, how quickly it morphs into fear when nobody explains the rules out loud. She ended it with a letter she wrote to herself at 16, when she first believed success meant being untouchable. I read it twice before I signed off. It didn't need edits. We waited until 3:11 a.m. when satellite interference was lowest. I triggered the modem. Connection established. The files went live. 5 seconds later, we shut everything down, smashed the modem casing, and buried the fragments in a metal tin behind the cabin. Nothing traceable remained. I looked at Samantha. She didn't smile. Neither did I. We weren't celebrating. We were bracing. 2 hours later, a small plane passed overhead. No markings, no flight plan visible. Samantha said it could be a coincidence. I didn't answer. We packed everything we hadn't burned and moved it to the crawl space under the porch. Then we waited. We kept the oil lamps low. We watched the tree line through the gaps in the siding. We didn't speak unless necessary. By morning, the impact had already started. For news sites reprinted excerpts under pseudonyms. Independent journalists posted breakdowns of key claims. Forums filled with screenshots, highlighted paragraphs, industry whistleblowers validating key points. Within 12 hours, 2 companies issued vague statements about internal reviews. Within 16, a private security firm filed an injunction against one of our publishing mirrors. It was spreading faster than they could kill it. For the first time, they had to chase us. Then came the breach. At 2:44 p.m., our fallback email received a message from an internal whistleblower. Attached was a single JPEG. The photo was of my uncle's cabin, taken from a distance, maybe with a long lens, but recent. The timestamp matched the current hour. No message, no threat. Just the photo. They had found us. We didn't run. We moved everything to the fallback location, an underground storage space 200 feet from the tree line, covered by a hidden hatch beneath a rotted shed. I left a decoy draft in the cabin, complete with false annotations and dummy USB drives. Then we waited again. They didn't come that night. Or the next. But the sound of a vehicle passing in the distance, the flicker of movement between branches, the absence of birds, none of it let us sleep. On the 3rd day, Samantha asked the question I'd been avoiding. What happens when they stop chasing? They won't. Then what are we still doing here? We're waiting for the last hit. She looked at me. What's that mean? It means we won. They just haven't admitted it yet. She didn't respond. She walked outside and sat under the steps. I found her an hour later, writing on the back of a grocery receipt. I didn't ask what it was. She folded it twice and slipped it into her pocket. That night, we received one more message. An audio file. No metadata. No sender. It was my voice, pulled from an old recording, one I didn't remember. I was talking about a campaign I ran in 2016, one that twisted a suicide victim's story into a promotional platform for an antidepressant client. I was laughing in the clip. I said something I couldn't take back. Then the audio ended. I closed the file and didn't say anything. Samantha asked what we should do. I said nothing. She said, "They're trying to end you." I said, "They already did." She stared at me, then asked, "So who are you now?" I picked up a pen, opened a fresh notebook, and said, "We're about to find out." The rain started without warning, fast and hard enough to strip leaves from the trees. The roof leaked in 2 places, the crawl space flooded, and one of our storage containers floated free before Samantha caught it with her jacket sleeve and dragged it back under. The storm knocked out the generator, and by nightfall, the only light came from a cracked oil lamp and the heat of our own tension. We spoke less now, not out of fear but focus. The book was done. The truth was public. But we were still waiting for the second wave, legal, personal, physical. We'd torn the curtain. That didn't mean the show was over. I checked the radio once an hour. Static on most channels. White noise on the others. Someone had scrubbed local signals. We weren't just cut off, we were being isolated. On the fourth morning, the generator kicked back on for 6 minutes, just long enough to charge the burner. There were 4 missed calls. All from my father's facility. I hadn't listed myself as the emergency contact in years. I didn't call back. I waited for voicemail. It never came. Samantha watched me from the table. She didn't ask what I was thinking. She didn't have to. She handed me the last clean page of her notebook and said, "If you don't want to write it, at least write around it." I sat down, uncapped the pen, and stared at the empty lines. Nothing moved. Not my hand. Not the air. Not even the light. Then I wrote a sentence about the day I left home. The real one. Not the cleaned-up version I used to repeat in interviews. The one where I lied about why I moved to the city, said I had a job lined up, told my parents I was doing it for a better future. I wrote about the silence that followed, the way my mother never once asked me to come back, how my father didn't even pretend to understand what I'd chosen. I wrote about the letters I never mailed, the ones where I told them I'd made the wrong trade. I wrote until the page was full and didn't stop when the ink started to smear. That afternoon, we saw the car. It didn't approach the house. It didn't even slow down. It stayed just far enough into the woods to make it unclear whether it was parked or idling. But it was there. We watched it for hours. At sunset, it was gone. No tire marks. No noise. Just absence. That night, I told Samantha we wouldn't stay another day. She didn't argue. She already had her boots on. We didn't take the old car. We left it as bait. Instead, we hiked north through a path my uncle had once used to trap deer. It was slow, wet, and unforgiving. Halfway through the 2nd mile, Samantha's knee gave out. I told her we could rest. She said we wouldn't make it if we stopped. She pushed forward. We reached the ridge before midnight and found the backup shelter, a metal container buried beneath debris and leaves, stocked with canned food, water tablets, and enough materials to survive a week. There was no heat, no insulation, no comfort. But it was secure. By dawn, we had a signal. Just enough for text. I messaged David in a single word. Live? He replied with a time-stamped image of a whiteboard full of redacted notes and a single headline on a monitor in the background. SEC opens inquiry into strategic lobbying firm following anonymous disclosures. He followed with, "They're cracking. You started it." Samantha didn't smile when I told her. She just sat down and opened her notebook. She started drafting the next piece. I asked what it would be. She said it would explain how the system didn't just tolerate corruption, it required it to function. She said it would name people. Not just executives, but journalists who looked away, consultants who reworded facts into fiction, interns who learned the rules and never questioned them. She said if it burned her name, it burned it clean. I offered to co-write. She said no. This one was hers. The next night, I made a decision. I wrote a message addressed to my mother. I didn't write for closure. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't explain anything. I simply told her I was still alive, that I had said something real, and that I hoped, one day, she would understand why I chose to give everything up instead of staying quiet. I didn't send it. I folded the paper and sealed it in a waterproof envelope. I buried it 10 feet from the shelter, under a rock that wouldn't move unless someone knew to look. At sunrise, Samantha handed me a flash drive. "It's done," she said. "But you have to be the one to send it." I asked why. She said because I was the reason she believed her story could matter. I said belief wasn't enough. She said that's all anything ever was, and the rest was just execution. I connected the drive, sent the file through a private mesh, and triggered 4 delayed uploads across mirror servers. No passwords. No takedowns. No way to kill it quietly. That evening, we heard the first radio mention. A small podcast, low audience, off-grid. But the host read a line from Samantha's opening paragraph. Then she said, "I don't know who wrote this, but whoever they are, they're not alone." I stepped outside, not to think, not to escape, just to feel air that hadn't passed through someone else's filters. Samantha stood beside me without speaking. In the distance, a new car had appeared. Not parked. Not hiding. Waiting. I asked, "Do you think they'll come?" She said, "If they do, let them see what they made."